Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called Prog Goes to the Movies. God, that's about the fourth time I've filmed this start because I couldn't decide what to call it. I was going to call it When Prog Goes to the Movies, and I didn't actually like that. I'm just going to call it Prog Goes to the Movies. Alright? On this channel I talk about prog, jazz fusion, classic rock, experimental music, jazz. You know, we get into all the sort of more esoteric music forms, right? These music forms aren't as in your face as heavy metal as say punk or reggae. They're not popular. It's an acquired taste, right? And I'm so often having to, you know, create a 10 greatest whatever, you know, 10 greatest prog pajamas or whatever it is, you know, and I'm trying to rank them and get them in an order. So whilst I've done this channel, I've sort of come up with my own set of criteria, really, you know. You can't just judge it on whether you like it. That's not good enough. I know that something can be great, and I don't like him. I don't like Bob Dylan much, but he's probably the greatest single musician of the last 60 years. And I know that. I can appreciate him, but I don't like him. And so when you look at it objectively like that, you start to bring in other things, right? The technical skill, innovation, popularity. You know, it's all great to go on about these obscure prog bands. Why didn't you mention so-and-so, right? But in the end, if the record labels put an album out and hardly anyone's bought it, it is technically a failure. It didn't ignite the general public for a reason. Perhaps it didn't tell a story. Now, stories are interesting because I think the best progressive rock tells a story, like a film. So although prog's quite an obscure music form, the actual music itself is very suited to film. And if we start to look at the times when prog is impinged on the film world, right, we start to see the points where prog is intersected with mainstream culture. You know, a lot of these bands we talk about, most normal people have never heard of before. You know, when we're arguing which is the best Gentle Giant album, you've got to remember that most people out there that don't know who Gentle Giant are. So when we see the points where it intersects into films, because films cost a lot of money, they have a lot of marketing behind them, we start to see aspects of progressive rock that you don't see if you look at it in a different way. These interjections into culture point to some of the best things about progressive rock, and in some cases also some of the worst, as we will see. So I've come up with here a list of 10 moments when prog has impinged itself into film in some way, okay? Either in the subject matter, or the music's being used as a background, or it's the actual soundtrack of it, or the film itself is progressive in its nature and it has prog people involved. There's a whole host, you know, there's 10, let's say a whole host, there's 10 here that I've come up with that I think are really interesting. There's a whole bunch of obvious choices we could have gone for. For example, Pink Floyd's The Wall. You know, that just shows the power of that band and the popularity to be able to make an album with such a strong concepts and storyline that it becomes a mainstream film, and the film is the film of that album. But then when you start to look at Pink Floyd, there's a whole load of other films they've been involved with, and I decided to go for one which is personal to me in that case, which I found I could talk about from my own subjective point of view. So in that case, the one I've picked is my objective view. In others, it is plain, you know, this is a point where prog really hit the mainstream. And my first choice at number 1 is Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells and its use in the film The Exorcist from 1973 that was directed by William Friedkin. Okay, now I am really on my knowledge here, so whether you're going to get the director of every single film, I don't know. I'm going to try my best, you know, on this list. As you know, I do a little bit of preparation. I've been exploring this and looking into different times, but I am on my general prog knowledge here. So Tubular Bells, we've discussed a whole ton on this channel. It's really is not just one of the biggest selling progressive rock albums of all time, but it's one of the biggest selling albums of all time. And it's a landmark album because it's one of the first albums that comes pretty much from the mind of just one person, and they're virtually playing all the instruments. That's really interesting when you look at the way music's made today. Often the whole track is created by one person sat behind a computer manipulating all these things. Mike Oldfield was the sort of first person to really do that. You know, people like Brian Wilson in the Pet Shop Boys, they went off and they were the mastermind behind those albums. But there's other players on those albums, and there's other people bringing in their artistic vision to those albums. Mike Oldfield is sat in a corner, right, dreaming up this incredible vision. Okay, the first album signed by Richard Branson to his newly emerged Virgin Records. I think the other one could have well been Angel's Egg by Gong. So we got two really weird hippie albums here, destined for obscurity. Now, William Friedkin is making a film of The Exorcist, okay? William Friedkin, like Mike Oldfield, is a very autocratic auteur. You know, he's got a vision for this film. He's coming off the back of a hugely successful film called The French Connection. On that, he's used the great Don Ellis. Don Ellis is a jazz musician who had an orchestra that made a whole ton of albums in the late 60s, early 70s that I think are benchmark albums for the development of jazz rock and prog. When I did my history of prog from 1967, I actually pulled out Electric Bath by Don Ellis. In 1971, Don Ellis creates the soundtrack to The French Connection. This shows that William Friedkin is interested in alternative soundtracks. He doesn't want the standard film score, I don't think. When he comes to making The Exorcist, he does hire a great film composer called Lalo Schifrin. You may know him from the theme to Mission Impossible. He did all the music to the Dirty Harry films. One of my favourite film composers. Lalo is an orchestral film composer, but he's able to take in contemporary sounds from the streets, you know, which you hear in Mission Impossible, especially from jazz. I think many of his soundtracks are some of the greatest jazz fusion albums in history. But what's interesting is that when Lalo Schifrin presented his album, his soundtrack to William Friedkin, he didn't like it at all. He hated it, and he sent him packing. So now, you know, Friedkin's got a film, and he's got no soundtrack. And as luck would have it, he hears this album, Tubular Bells. It's an instrumental album. It's got long form composition. So he decides to drop that into the soundtrack of the film. Now, what's that interesting when you watch The Exorcist? There's only 15 minutes of the album used on the film, so which renders most of the film without a soundtrack, which I think makes it more horrific. And I think that sets a standard where, you know, if you're truly trying to frighten an audience, you cut the music off. But you know, that sort of is it in 15, that 15/8 riff at the beginning of Tubular Bells, very influenced by people like Steve Reich and Terry Riley, very based upon minimalism. That becomes the hook, and it hooks people in. People who go to that film love that bit of music, and they go and buy the album, and it turns that album into one of the biggest selling albums in history. All this back in 1973, that landmark year, you know, exactly 50 years ago, when prog was now ruling the world, you know, selling millions of albums. So that's what I got as my first choice, is Tubular Bells. And this really shows how prog can wheedle its way into mainstream culture through film. Now, the original band that William Friedkin wanted to use was not Mike Oldfield. It was Tangerine Dream, right? So I thought I was going to another album, but I'm going to go to this album next because it does follow on. I was going to go to another album, and as I mentioned that, I realised that this is on the list. So at number 2, I have, from his follow-up to The Exorcist, the film The Sorcerer, we have the soundtrack to The Sorcerer, created by Tangerine Dream. Now, one of the interesting things about Mike Oldfield, he's not prog in the same way Genesis or Yes is. He's basically, it's expansive, but it's also he's using multi-tracking to create ensembles that don't exist in normality, you know. Now here I have to mention my great friend Rob Reed. My friend Rob Reed, who is from the prog band Magenta. He also has a prog band called Cyan, and I've played with him on a number of times. He is obsessed with Tubular Bells and Mike Oldfield, and he's actually made albums, I think 3 albums under the moniker Sanctuary, because he believes that that band that is used on Tubular Bells is a classic unit. You know, that sort of bass, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, percussion, vibraphone or glockenspiel, you know, and then that certain synth sound. That's a classic sound. As soon as you start to write music with that sound, you get a certain sound. This is very filmic. This approach to making music within progressive rock is far more popular in Europe, and there's a whole host of bands which are really pioneering the development of music created electronically. Kraftwerk would be a band that would be like that, but Tangerine Dream, even before then, are exploring ambience. They're exploring sort of space, using synthesis, using multi-tracking to create sort of ambient soundtracks. You know, they're ideal for the use for film soundtracks. So William Friedkin's idea of using them in The Exorcist, that's a very interesting idea. He gets to do it on The Sorcerer. Now The Sorcerer was seen as a bit of a flop. It's a remake of a film called Wages of Fear, and I think it's actually a book, and I think Friedkin was in his mind, he was filming the book, not making a remake of Wages of Fear. Wages of Fear is one of the greatest films ever made. It was a French film made in the early 50s, and it's a tale of a number of people trapped in this dead-end town, and they can't get out, and then they get offered to drive out of the town these bottles of nitroglycerin, and the whole film sort of tracks them taking this stuff out, and any slight bang is going to explode. Sometimes they've got to drive fast, sometimes they've got to drive slow, and then it explores what goes on in that pressure cooker mind of the characters in the film as they're put into that situation. It's a brilliant film. I think that The Sorcerer by Friedkin is another masterpiece. I think it didn't have such a clear objective of a theme as The Exorcist or The French Connection. I don't think people knew what to expect, and of course in 1977 when it came out, he walked straight into Star Wars. It had a lot of money spent on it, but what's interesting is because it was quite a high profile film, it propelled Tangerine Dream to quite a lot of success. We're now seeing progressive rock bands becoming well known because of their soundtracks. You know, that's the first and foremost. Tangerine Dream then go on to do quite a lot of film soundtracks, but there's a progressive rock band which I've got at number 3. I'm actually changing my order to because it's fitting my storyline as we talk. But there's another progressive rock band that are entirely known because of their film soundtracks, and that's the Italian progressive rock band Goblin. Goblin are very much like Tangerine Dream, but a lot more darker and gothic. And they're formed early 70s, I think, and their first album is a straight progressive rock album, and then the great horror director Dario Argento starts to hire them to create soundtracks for his films. The one I'm putting forward is Suspiria, but there's also Deep Red or Profondo Rosso, whatever it's called. Both of those are 2 classic films, but the one I'm going to put on here on the list is Suspiria, which is an absolute masterpiece, where I think Dario Argento actually was able to get hold of old film stock, and it's got that deep, rich colour that you expect from old Technicolor films. It's a modern horror, but it's also exploring gothic horror, and Goblin are perfect for this. Goblin are propelled to stardom. Their sales come directly from these films, and they basically become known as a band that makes film soundtracks. Now, how many bands can you think of like that? This is absolutely unique. I don't think I've ever mentioned Goblin on this channel because Goblin occupy their own space, but Goblin are a progressive rock band. They're a band. It's not a composer. It's not somebody creating music for film. They're a band. This is really fascinating stuff. And the fact that with Tangerine Dream and the fact with Goblin, we've got this electronica, early electronica, ambient, experimental, European approach to prog, which is really fitting so well into film. In the 80s, we see this really go up a notch, where the keyboardist, ex-keyboardist of Aphrodite's Child, another great Italian prog band, you know, gets drafted in. This is Vangelis. Vangelis has made some incredible progressive rock albums in the 70s. I'm thinking of like 666, really gothic stuff. Here he is making soundtracks. Now, the obvious one would be to put Chariots of Fire. Chariots of Fire, especially here in the UK, because it won the Oscar for Best Film. That soundtrack is iconic. That electronic prog soundtrack is absolutely iconic. You know, everybody knows that. That's prog. But that's not the soundtrack I'm going to put in. I'm going to put in at number 4 his soundtrack to Blade Runner. Blade Runner really sets the standard filmically for a sort of dystopian, futuristic view of the world. And of course, that dystopian, futuristic view then comes back into prog. And how many prog metal bands have released albums with a concept based around some future dystopia, you know, with a cover that looks like a film still from Blade Runner. But on that soundtrack, the use of electronics, the use of orchestration, progressive rock approaches creates, I think, an alternative to the full orchestra film score approach to Hollywood films. You know, in these 3 films, well, 4 actually, Tubular Bells and Exorcist, Sorcerer Tangerine Dream, Goblin Suspiria, and then Vangelis Blade Runner, I hopefully have charted the development of this huge area that I've never ever spoken about on this channel, but is actually a cornerstone of what makes progressive rock great and where it really has reached millions and millions of people, right? So that's my first 4 choices, okay? And I'm going to come back to the proggy electronica soundtrack right at the end with something really obscure, which I think would be great to point out. But we're going to move on. Earlier on I mentioned Pink Floyd The Wall. You know, this is one of the great progressive rock films, isn't it? Pink Floyd's albums are they're vast and orchestral in their scope, but also they tell stories, and many of these stories are very filmic. The Wall is a great example of this. But of course, if we go back to the history of Pink Floyd, how many soundtracks albums have they made? You know, often for films that we don't know. Most of us have never seen Zabriskie Point or More or any of these films, Obscured by Clouds. Has anyone ever watched any of these films? I think the Zabriskie Point was relatively well known on a cult level back in the late 60s, early 70s. But here we haven't, and I could have chosen any of these, you know, I could have chosen The Wall, Zabriskie Point, Obscured by Clouds. I could have chosen any of these, and it would have been a brilliant choice to point at Pink Floyd, one of the biggest bands in the world, and look how many film soundtracks they have made. But there's one I haven't mentioned, right? And that is a soundtrack to the surfing documentary Crystal Voyager. When I was a young boy, we would, back in the 70s, you would get up in the morning and you'd put the television on, and there might be a few programs that they'd put on here in the UK for us nippers to watch. Maybe a bit of Why Don't You? We watch a bit of that, you know. But Why Don't You was you know, urging us to get out the side and actually go and do something outside. You know, remember when kids used to do stuff outside? Every now and then, this weird surfing documentary would come up, and it was very trippy. It was very obviously made by hippies, and there was some hippie surfer, and he was going around, and he wasn't competing. There's no real storyline. What he was doing was enjoying the experience of surfing. I'm telling you from me as a little lad watching this. I used to watch this, and the incredible camera work, because the camera was under the water, and we would get these incredible psychedelic shots under the water with the surfboard going across the top of the ocean, the waves rippling in the sunshine, and all this sort of psychedelic effects going on, and the soundtrack to that was Pink Floyd. I saw this maybe 3 times when I was young. They played it a number of times. You know, it was this or Singing Ringing Tree. Both of them absolutely compelling, and both of them disturbing in a way, because on that there was tracks, and I think on that film it titles the tracks. So there was Careful With That Axe, Eugene, Set Controls to the Heart of the Sun. This is where I first came across Pink Floyd, was on this film. They're the tracks I know. Right, not the Syd Barrett stuff, not Dark Side of the Moon, not The Wall. It was this stuff. It was this stuff that I really liked. When I got older, Pink Floyd made another film, Pink Floyd at Pompeii. I think this is my favourite moment of Pink Floyd, is Pink Floyd at Pompeii. Right, so there's all these films. This is really to represent that, but I really wanted to talk about Crystal Voyager and how compelling that was, the way that music could paint the picture of this alternative world under the sea. You know, and as a young person, not understanding any of the psychedelic drug thing about that at all, just seeing it as an expression of nature and being in nature. And how interesting it is how my whole life has been determined by music. I'm here talking to you because when I was a little, I heard certain things. You know, you grow up in a vacuum. Nobody comes around your house when you're 6 years old and, you know, sticks on a Magma album. It just doesn't happen. You've got to find this stuff, and most people see this stuff and it's of no interest to them. But all of you out there, you're like me, right? These little glints, and in Crystal Voyager literally, these little glints of stuff coming through the ether. You know, a focus track on the theme of a TV show. Van de Graaff Generator being used as the theme to Friday Night Rock show here in the BBC. And Crystal Voyager every summer holidays, you know, when they churn that out to fill a bit of time in daytime TV. This is where music can come through culturally and grab people and reach at them. So that's what I've got at number 5, is Crystal Voyager. So this music's great, but you can pull stuff off the peg, can't you? You know, it's great for film, and it's great when you've got, you know, bands like Goblin and Tangerine Dream creating soundtracks with all these electronics. It's all great. But this music's also fantastic. You can just pull it, you know, prog classics, and bang them into films. There's a whole bunch of times that's happened. Tubular Bells doesn't affect that, but you've got to remember Tubular Bells wasn't that well known when Freakin' did that. I'm now going to give you 2 examples that I think are brilliant examples of a prog song being used in a film. So at number 6, I've got Focus's Hocus Pocus and its use in the film Baby Driver. Baby Driver is a sort of comedy thriller, and there's an incredible car chase and shootout and chase. It's absolutely fantastic piece of filmmaking. You know, incredibly brilliantly cut. The action's fantastic. You know, it's violent, it's explosive, but they have cut the whole scene to Hocus Pocus, right? And the whole thing builds, the cutting, the gunshots, right up to the final 3 shots that takes the person out, which hit on the stabs of Hocus Pocus. This is an absolute brilliant use. Hocus Pocus is so driving and exciting, and you know, it's a bit of a show-off piece. You know, it's a show-off piece for Jan Akkerman on guitar. It's a show-off piece for Pierre Van Linden on drums. But then, as soon as you put it in that film and you see the person running and tripping and you hear the drums and all that flying off, it's an absolutely brilliant conjunction of music and visual image just coming together. And it's a cool film, you know, and I wonder how many people have watched that film and thought, what the hell is this insane heavy metal yodeling going on at the back of this? Absolutely brilliant. So I think that's one of the great uses of progressive rock in a mainstream film. But there is one more other one I want to put in, which I've got at number 7. In 2018, Nicolas Cage made a film called Mandy. It's a pretty disturbing film, right? I've never seen anything like that. If you like cult disturbing films, this is the one for you. At one point, Nicolas Cage, who is trying to avenge the murder of his girlfriend by a religious cult, ends up having a full-on chainsaw fight. There's not many films where you get to see a chainsaw fight. The opening credits are absolutely bizarre. A surreal, horrific. You can tell when it's hard to describe it. I'll start again. A surreal, horrific. I'm going to go for melange. Is that a word? Melange? I feel like I want to use the word melange. I'm going to look it up. Melange. Is it a word? It's not a word, is it? Oh, this is why you've come to watch my videos, isn't it? Melange meaning. Right, it means a varied mixture. I was right. Oh, I like to use the big words. You know, we're a progressive rock channel here. I like to use the big words. I forgot what the other two were now. A surreal, horrific melange. Oh, I better start again. You can't even remember what I'm talking about. So there's this film called Mandy. It's made in 2018. It's weird. There's a chainsaw battle in it. It's got Nicolas Cage, and it opens up. The title sequence opens up with a surreal, horrific melange of surreal. Oh, I've used the word surreal again. Of disturbing. A surreal, horrific melange of disturbing imagery. Nicolas Cage in his pants covered in blood. Right? Strange white ghostly faces coming at you. Bit like this. Right? Stars twisting in the sky. And over this, we have the incredible, one of the greatest progressive rock songs ever. We have by King Crimson, Starless. It's an absolutely beautiful, horrific, dark, gothic moment in film. And it really does fit King Crimson so well. So that's what I've got. I'm moving on. I've lost my bit of my list now. Where's my list? 10 albums. No, not 10 albums that created jazz rock. I've done that. What are we doing today? Can you remember? Prog at the movies. Right, so I've got 2 more to go, haven't I? All right, so number 9. I thought, let's get obscure. Let's mention something that you didn't expect me. You know, let me earn my, obscure prog knowledge credentials, because I know the proggers out there. So at number 9, I have, from, is it the 1980 film starring Bob Hoskins, The Long Good Friday, with an incredible prog soundtrack created by the great Francis Monkman, who is the keyboardist, or was the keyboardist with Curved Air, and then teamed up with John Williams in the late 70s pop symphonic classical prog, supergroup Sky. I was chatting to my friend the other day, and he was on Facebook, and it had been a very, very beautiful sunset, and everyone was photographing it like they do, oh, there's a lovely sunset outside my house, and they post it up, and they go, next one, there's a lovely sunset outside my house, and they post up that, and my mate said, if anyone else puts a picture of Sky up, I'm going to go up the wall. So, of course, I then stick onto his Facebook page a picture of the 70s progressive rock band Sky, and he said something like, nobody ever talks about them, and we never mention them. They were huge in the 70s here in the UK, and so I went and looked at their version of Toccata and Fugue, the Bach tune that they do for sort of rock band, and I got to admit, I enjoyed every single. I love prog, and I enjoyed every minute of it. And there was Francis Monkman really holding down those Bach-esque chords, right? So coming off the back of his success with the very well selling Sky, he gets asked to do the soundtrack to A Long Good Friday, and what he creates is a very, very progressive rock full band, but a very electronic. It's like somewhere between what Blade Runner's what Vangelis is doing on Blade Runner and Chariots of Fire. It's a cross between that and then proper prog. It opens with an overture. This is full on prog. You could sit down and watch that and really sit down with the album. It's a progressive rock album. So that's what I've got. And actually, because I've lost count, I told you I'd lost count. That was at number 8. So I've got 2 more to go now. So these are my last 2 choices, right? So at number 9, I have the most proggiest of prog films ever made. Right? This film is overblown, outlandish, surreal, bizarre. It's full of prog. Right? And this film, from I think probably 76, 77, I'm not sure. I'm going for 76, 77. It's either 76 or 77. We have from the incredible Mr. Prog of film himself, from the great Ken Russell, Listomania, starring Roger Daltrey, a surreal, over-the-top biography of the classical composer Liszt, which places Liszt in the 70s or in Victorian, a bit of both really, in both time scales, as a sort of pop star. The soundtrack was created by Rick Wakeman. This is in this bubble between 73 and 77 where prog is at its peak, but is also imploding at the same time. Listomania is can be seen as one huge beautiful failure of a film. I've gone back and revisited it again. It's so over the top, it's so camp, it's so, everything's pushed to the max. It's what everybody accuses prog of being when they're trying to criticize prog. Now, the coming together of Rick Wakeman and Ken Russell is a very telling and important moment in the history of prog that we haven't discussed here. Rick Wakeman not only did the soundtrack this, he actually appears in it as well, and he appears as Thor. And if there ever was a progressive rock musician born to play Thor, it's Rick Wakeman. And I think, with the way the Marvel Thors are going at the moment, I'm sure those actors are going to duck out. And so I just wonder whether Rick just could come back one more time and do it again. Rick, come on, are you watching this, Rick? Come back and play Thor. You could do it. You've done it once, you can do it again. Ken Russell is often described as the enfant terrible of film. I don't quite know what that means. I think it's his reluctance to play the game. There's something genius about Ken Russell, but there's also something outlandish and pretentious and over the top and bad taste about Ken Russell. He comes to notice making films for the BBC in the early 60s, and what's interesting, he's making films where he's creating biopics of classical composers. He does one for Elgar, I think, and then he does one for Delius. So he has a relationship with music which is very interesting. Later on he makes films like The Devils, which are absolute gothic masterpieces, and if there's ever a proggy early 70s films which, right in that formative period of prog that we could look at, it would be The Devils. He has a lot of success. Back then he's Flavour of the Month, and he gets pulled in to make the film version of Tommy. Now that was the obvious choice, and I wrote down Tommy to start with. I thought, let's talk about Tommy, The Who. Is The Who prog? Well, nearly. Is Tommy the album a prog album? Yeah, it's. I would describe it as a rock opera. And then when they make the film, they bring in people like Elton John, they bring in Eric Clapton, all these people come into it, all these musicians, and it is this great big epic over the top film where no one speaks a word. It's music all the way through. Tommy has to be on the list, but it's not, because I think Listomania is just even more prog. Another film director that sort of echoes this is Nicholas Roeg. I haven't got him on the list, but I nearly put him on. Nicholas Roeg sort of again emerges late 60s, he's actually, I think he's a cameraman or second unit director on The Devils. Then he makes Walkabout, one of the great, and Performance. These are two. This is this era where you got progressive rock and this British, quite challenging filmmaking. And Nicholas Roeg becomes sort of flavour at the moment at that point, and he ends up going on to make The Man Who Fell to Earth with David Bowie, which is a similar period. We've got this prog at the movies thing, but I'm going to represent that with the most over-the-top one, which is Listomania. It's well worth going to see. It's so prog, and actually it's interesting to sit down and listen to the album that Rick Wakeman made. He's coming off the back of two of the greatest progressive rock albums of all time, which I haven't talked about much on this channel, which would be Six Wives of Henry VIII and Journey to the Centre of the Earth. I think there's another one, isn't there? There's a whole bunch of albums there that for some people are some of the greatest progressive rock albums. King Arthur, the King Arthur one, the one that he did on ice. And then following on from that, we have this Listomania soundtrack. It doesn't get mentioned that much. We might have to come back to this. We might have to come back to Rick Wakeman. I'm not going to come back to Rick Wakeman unless he's on my channel. I got a mate of mine who's his tour manager, and I did put the feelers out to try and get an interview with Rick, and he didn't want to know. He didn't want to know about us with our little YouTube channel here, but I would love to have him on. You'd love to have him on. He is the example of just prog, that if you just embody prog into a person in a way where the mainstream audience get it, where he just is a celebrity here in the UK. Rick Wakeman is, everyone knows Rick Wakeman. He'll appear on talk shows talking about other stuff. He's a celebrity, and I think that's really interesting that he was able to come out as a band as serious as Yes, go even more over the top with these trio albums that get more and more outlandish until in the end he's telling the story of the Knights of King Arthur and on ice with people jousting on the backs of horses with ice skates. How the hell do they do that? How do they train them to do this? Incredible. But from there he takes the topness of prog and he runs with it, opening up a career for himself as a celebrity. It's very interesting. I'm going to move on because I know I'm going to talk about this. So I've got through all of them except for the last one. So what is my last choice of when prog goes to the movies? Well, we've looked at where prog bands have made soundtracks for movies. We've looked at when prog songs have been used in the movies. We've even looked at with Rick Wakeman where prog musicians appear in films, right? The one thing we haven't done is talk about when films point to prog, where they gesticulate towards it. And I think without doubt, the greatest moment that happens in film is a moment in film that gets mentioned over and over again. Often when I do these videos and then I get onto Facebook, people say, "Oh, you've forgotten this." And it happened with my, great prog moustaches. Okay? Everybody was very upset on my greatest prog moustaches that I didn't include Derek Smalls from Spinal Tap. Now, the reason I didn't include him is because he's not real. Well, that was one of my... I didn't say it, but one of the rules I had is that the person had to be an actual person and not a character. Spinal Tap is not real. They're not a real band. Now, Derek Smalls modelled his moustache on the bass player from Saxon, who had that beautiful walrus moustache. But there was another guy in Saxon who had another. There was a couple of another moustache in Saxon. There was one of the guys he had curly hair and a moustache. Any Saxon fans will be now typing desperately into the comments who I'm talking about. But in Spinal Tap, there is a moment which is, of course, Stonehenge. And Stonehenge, I think, when you are talking to normal people, they don't know what prog is, they haven't got a clue. It's always wise to go, well, have you ever seen Spinal Tap? And if they have, then you can say, well, Stonehenge, that's what prog is. And it is, isn't it? Of course, and for me, it's the funniest moment in the film, where they've asked Nigel Tufnell, the great Nigel Tufnell, of course, who is based upon Jeff Beck, you know, to give the dimensions of the huge Stonehenge monument that they want to erect while they perform Stonehenge. And instead of putting feet on inches, so instead of them being 18 feet tall, he writes 18 inches by mistake, and the artist then dutifully creates a Stonehenge monument which is 18 inches tall. And as they're performing this beautifully crafted, you know, satire on most progressive rock tunes, down from the heavens descends this tiny little Stonehenge. And then to make it look bigger, I think they send a couple of dwarves out in medieval attire. Am I allowed to say dwarves in today's politically correct climate? I am, aren't I? Or am I? Or should I say small people? That sounds worse to me. When I say small people, it sounds worse. I'm going to go with dwarves. Okay? So, if there are any dwarves watching, I apologise, and I can only atone for my ignorance of not saying the words that I should say. I will do that later. Okay? I'll do it, but I'll stick a Lighthouse Family album on. Will that do it? I knew this video was going to get silly. If you watch this video back at the start, you hear my voice is really serious. I thought, no, you try and stay serious on this one, Andy. But in the end, all I've talked about is dwarves and moustaches and Rick Wakeman taking over from Chris Hemsworth in the Marvel series. Covered a lot of ground. Hope you enjoyed this foray into the world of progressive rock. What have we learnt from this video? Pardon? Well, what we've learnt is that there's a thing about progressive rock people don't talk about, and it's the creation of an alternative way of creating film soundtracks, which has now become almost like the standard. And there's all these incredible sort of electronic ambient soundtracks that have come from progressive rock, and that's a big cultural thing. That's a big thing that prog has given to the world, right? We've learnt that some of these songs are incredible, and when you stick them in a film soundtrack and everybody can't see, you know, the flowing robes and the big moustaches and the long hair and the Stone Age monuments in the background, they can be seen in a different way, and we see that they can crop up in very cool places, and prog can be seen as being cool, right? This is very exciting. You know, we've discussed Pink Floyd and their huge sort of foray into films, millions of films. You know, prog can be, when you put prog in a film, it can either be ridiculous like Listomania, or it can be cool. Now, last night I came across a new album by the trap rap artist LIL YACHTY, and I sat and listened to it, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's fantastic. The opening track, which I think is called Black Seminole, sounds like a classic Pink Floyd track with a trap rapper singing over it. He's still singing it in that awful auto-tuned way. But I like it in that context. Some of the other tracks are like really funky with slap bass on. There's guitar solos on there. There's tempo changes. There's real players. They sound like they're playing real because they're speeding up and slowing down. There's experimental stuff. Lil Yachty, I'll tell you, Lil Yachty, the trap rapper, has made a progressive rock album. You know why he's done that? Because, and this is why I do this channel, right? I'm a musician. I've grown up with musicians in all different styles of music, in all different contexts, right? And in the end, when you sit down with them and they sit down and put a record on, what do they listen to? They listen to Dark Side of the Moon. They listen to Yes. They listen to Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath. They listen to the Mavish Juncture. They listen to Miles Davis. It's what we all listen to. And I know Lil Yachty has been sat there going, why am I making this awful trap for when I could be making music that sounds like the albums I actually listen to when I go home? Well done, mate. Well done. I applaud you for that. Right, and I wasn't going to plan to talk about that, but I have, and I'm going to put it on the title. So this video is now going to be called "When Prog Goes to the Movies" / and when Lil Yachty went prog, or something like that. I don't know. I'm making all this up as I go along. All right, prog can be cool. And maybe that shows us that, that maybe we're on a renaissance. Maybe the whole world's going to invert now. Maybe the whole thing's just going to turn upside down in some great Gnostic twist, right? And what was above becomes below. And all the awful modern pop music made on all those awful computers with all the awful loops that they just downloaded off the internet and all the awful auto-tune and everything stuck to the grid, sound like a bunch of robots making something which is just about them boasting about how great they are. Maybe that will all sink to the bottom. And Little Yachty will be talking about this in 20 years of when he changed the music industry and everyone went, oh yeah, let's go back to listening to some music again. Let's go back to doing that. Oh, can you imagine it? Be absolutely amazing. And then everybody comes onto the internet. Oh, I want to know about this prog. What's this prog? All the little kids, what's this prog? They're all talking about it's a new great thing, isn't it? I want to know about prog. And they log in and they find my channel. And my channel just goes through the roof. We get millions of views. The money starts pouring in. I can start driving around like Little Yachty in my Ferrari. Oh my God, I'm off on a tangent here. I'm off on a tangent. I'm dreaming. Stories. I tell you, it would make a good story for a film, wouldn't it? Producers out there, I'm ready for this. Middle-aged, has-been progressive rock drummer with his little YouTube channel is finally discovered, right? When the whole world inverts and progressive rock becomes the most popular music on the planet. But there's got to be, it'll be like A Star Is Born, isn't it? I'll come to a bad end, won't I? That's the only way that film can play out. You know what I read the other day? I read that the cool kids in London are listening to Steely Dan. What's going on with the world? I'm sure there's a Nostradamus prediction that predicts that when the cool kids in London start listening to Steely Dan, it's the end of the world. Maybe this isn't a good sign. Maybe it's not a good sign at all. Maybe all those dystopian themes that Vangelis was trying to illustrate so well 40 years ago, maybe it's all about to come true. I don't know. I've gone from being positive and seeing a beautifully bright future for me to now terrified that the end is nigh. I didn't expect to talk about this in this video. I really didn't. But I have done. And that's where we've ended up with, haven't we? I feel like I've reached a natural end to this one. Do you feel like that? You feel like we've got somewhere now, haven't we? I didn't quite feel it when I said we were at the end. But I feel like we've got there now. We've covered a lot of ground in that last few minutes, haven't we? A lot of ground. Whew. Right, so if you like this absolute prog nonsense, stick a like in there. If you want to know more, you can then press the subscribe button. And then YouTube will stick my videos at you for about 4 or 5 days. So it forgets about me. But if you want to know when I've got a video coming out, you can press the notification bell and it will ring. I don't think it actually does ring. But if you really want the esoteric heart of what I do, if you really want to dig deep and go to places where nobody's gone before, if you really want to explore the secret depths of my prog-addled brain, then click on Patreon, pay me some money, right, and you get access to a whole ton of stuff. You know what I'm going to do when this video finishes off? I'm going over to play some records for my patrons. They get to hear records on here. You don't, because if I do it, then some obscure prog person that needs the money will get the money. They'll demonetize my video. Oh my God, I can't have that. I can't have that. I'm not doing this for nothing, you know. I'm not doing it for the love of it. Well, I am a little bit, you know. Anyway, I'm done now. I'm definitely at the end. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye, 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 bye.